Hey, John Gilroy here. Last night, HBO released Wild Wild Space. It's a documentary about satellites that are up there 1,200 miles from Earth. Today, we look at generative AI from a similar global perspective. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, a podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Today in the studio, the virtual studio, we have world-famous Jim Richberg. He's the global field CISO for Fortinet. He's also a board member for Fortinet Federal. Jim, I'm really pumping you up here. You got a great background, don't you? You see things from many, many miles away, don't you?
Well, thanks, John. I mean, yeah, I'm an astronomer, so I've got 15 telescopes, and I love looking way, way far out.
Yes. Yeah. If you follow Jim on LinkedIn, yeah, he's in front of Congress. Yeah, he's over in Europe. Yeah, he's doing this. I mean, it's just you've got this great perspective that sometimes I tend to get mired in the weeds and I get too. What about, role-based access controls versus attribute-based? But sometimes you need to take and pull up and go, okay, let's look at this crazy. Okay, generative AI. We know the dazzle. Yeah, yakety yak. So what's that mean for my govies? What's that mean for a federal agency? And so Jim lives in Richberg. Let's say we're sitting at Goose Cup and having a cup of coffee. And I turn to him and go, okay, Jim, I don't want to hear your stories about your travel adventures in Iceland. Tell me about generative AI. I mean, so what does it mean for the federal government? I mean, should they be using this? Is it too early? Are they behind the eight ball? Or throw me a lifeline here?
Well, first, John, you're right. Right now, we're early in the hype cycle about generative AI. And the thing to keep in mind is generative AI is not the only kind of AI out there. I mean, there really are two kinds of AI, according to our friends at NIST. You have generative AI, where the focus is trying to create a model that can understand a data set well enough to say, can you synthesize or generate a new piece of data that would fit in there? For instance, do I understand dogs well enough to generate something that is a dog? Now, the other kind of AI is discriminative or predictive AI. Do I understand the data well enough to be able to understand the boundaries between categories? So can I look at something and say, this is a dog and not a cat? Can I make predictions? We've been doing that one for a long time. Big data analytics is really about that kind of predictive AI. Cybersecurity has been fundamentally built on discriminative AI. I mean, we've looked at trillions of pieces of malware well enough to say, looking at a new piece of code, is this clean or dirty? So that kind has been with us for decades. And frankly, that has been transformational for cybersecurity. Generative AI, not so much. You and I were talking before we went live about we have not yet found the equivalent of the killer application, the killer app that will drive the adoption of transform your business. It was things like the spreadsheet and word processing for personal computer. We don't yet have that for generative AI. So when we talk about cybersecurity and generative AI, I think it can help at the network operations center, the security operations center level. Can you learn, and I'm using air quotes, the network well enough to say, here's a problem, can I drop it in and you tell me how to respond for that? Has that transformed life? No, not really.
And I've talked to lots and lots of people about this, and there's lots and lots of, well, we can do this and can do that. Now, can it create a report for you, for your boss about maybe, I don't know if it's going to be accurate or not. Is it going to be repeatable? We don't know yet. We're kind of in the early stages of this. But, Jim, we're sitting here in the United States. We're all fat and sassy, and we're talking about applying AI. Well, there's bad guys over this side of the world that are going, oh, boy, thank you. And they're looking at it, too, and they're looking at new ways to attack.
So, but again, John, I think we hype that as well. The British government released an assessment earlier this year that I found very credible, and it said generative AI for attackers has largely helped those nation-state adversaries who are already capable in cyber attack and capable in artificial intelligence. Now, that's a relatively small handful. Now, yes, it does allow you to develop code for new exploits, but the reality is They don't always work, and they're often noisy. They're not the kind of stealthy tools that an adversary would want to use. Now, the opportunity costs for using it and failing are pretty low. You use it and it fails, and it's not like somebody knocks at your door and arrests you. But the idea that generative AI has fundamentally transformed the way cyber attackers operate, it has not yet happened to date. It's made the good better. It's lowered the bar for people to try. But again, even the attackers have not yet found that killer application. Now, there is one use case, John, and it's really relevant for where we are in 2024. Misdis and malinformation, MDM, influence operations, the kind of thing that gets thrown at politics. What it took Russia, about 500 people who spoke English really well, who understood our culture, who could run social media accounts. What took 500 people to do, generative AI would allow 2 or 3 people who only speak English well enough to spot AI hallucinations when it, generates the equivalent of the dog with 5 legs. It lowers the barrier for entry for that kind of thing, which means more people may play in trying to influence political outcomes in 2024, or you may start seeing it below the national level, congressional, even local politics. You're in Purcellville. You start seeing something like this get used potentially even as low as that. So content generation for misdis and malinformation, yeah, this has been utterly transformational. Malware across the board, not so much yet. It may be coming, but it's not here.
Yesterday, I was speaking to a gentleman who was in the military, and while he was in the military, he was on a red team. Mm-hmm. And I asked him, I said, okay, Chase, we know your background. You got a PhD. You're a real smart guy. You were on red teams, DOD. And so do you think you'd use AI to help? And he gave me a nuanced answer, kind of like yours. He said, in a lot of ways it can, but, it has to be used adroitly. It's not like this. It's not the easy button. It's just another tool. But just because you have another tool doesn't mean using it correctly. So I think it's not a black and white. Oh, the bad guys have it and we don't. And they can screw up with it too, can't they? They can get hallucinations as well as us.
So John, I talked to a friend who is at one of the big tech companies that makes the models. And they laid out 3 criteria for when you don't want to use generative AI. And those have stuck with me. Don't use it when you have to be 100% accurate. 90% is not good enough. You need to be perfect. Now, nothing's perfect, but I need 99 and some trailing 9s after the decimal point. When it has to be instant, and I don't mean a couple of seconds. And of course, we've all played around with these generative AI packages, and you ask it something, and you get an answer pretty quickly, but it's not in real time. Not like I would want my car making the decision to brake or not brake. And the third is when the human can't judge the accuracy of the output. And that's why there's such a focus on explainability. Doesn't mean the human needs to be able to reproduce what it does, but if you can't tell good from bad outcome, you're utterly dependent. So those to me have stuck out as when you don't use it. And that applies to bad guys too. I mean, if I'm a red team tester, I don't want a noisy exploit. I don't want something that's going to fail. I don't want, so I think that's for me, a good litmus test on maybe not when to use it, but what the red banner should say, do not apply Gen AI when I need any of those 3 things to be applicable.
I was taking notes early in our discussion. You wrote down predictive analytics, predictive AI. What I'm considering is that the attack surface has expanded drastically. We know that. And we know the number of attacks have increased and maybe beyond the capabilities of a human. But stepping aside from Gen AI, there's other type of AI that can help with that inundation of alerts and filtering through beyond humans' ability. There's so much. People are talking about petabytes now. It's just no human can do it. Maybe another flavor of AI can help in that area of cybersecurity.
And it has, John. And that's where it's been the quiet revolution that I say over the past 10 years, it's utterly transformed the way we do cybersecurity. The idea that, yes, to your point, we see petabytes of data. I mean, a company like mine, we get hundreds of millions of security alerts a day. We don't have enough employees or none of human beings on earth to go through that. It's been done by machines. But what this has done, John, is it's instrumented that attack surface that you've mentioned. It's turned size and complexity from a challenge. I mean, I can't protect everything. No, I can't. I don't understand everything. But if I've instrumented it, I sense a disturbance in the force. I see somebody trying to do something. And as somebody who ran offense in his government career, it's only in Hollywood that somebody sits down behind the keyboard, writes the code. They don't even bother to compile it. They write the code, they launch it, it bounces all over the world, hits the target, gets in and game over. Attackers try and fail a lot of times before they succeed. They rely on hiding in the noise. They rely on the defenders can't be looking everywhere all of the time. And even if they see it, is it an anomaly or is it real? Is it significant? Is it not? When you instrument that attack surface, the sensors never blink. They don't get tired at the end of shift, and they pick the data up and they allow you to sense the disturbance in the force. And predictive AI machine learning is really good at allowing you to say, this one has the potential to be harmful, or even better, this matches the known characteristics of bad activity. This is bad. So you block them at point of attack and you inoculate yourself globally. And that's fundamentally transformed cybersecurity. Size and complexity remains challenging, but it also allows us to have broader telemetry and instrumentation than our attackers can.
If you would like more information about Jim, I got more questions, but if you want to find more about Fortinet Federal, just go to fortinetfederal.com. I'm sure there's all kinds of information that they can provide, and very few people with the rich background that Jim may not be rich, but he has a rich background in cybersecurity. I know that.
Thanks, John.
I love quoting people from other podcasts. I listen all the time. And there's a woman from Salesforce named Karen Hay. And tell you what, give her a T-shirt or something. I mean, she said that generative AI can unlock the knowledge trapped in data. Wow. I love that. Isn't that a nice summary of what you did with all the petabytes of information you guys are getting?
We talk about generative AI is going to displace people from the workforce. Well, it's people like you and me. It's content generation. And I think now the meme has become not that Gen AI is going to take your job. It's that somebody who is more adept at using Gen AI is going to take your job. And that actually characterizes the investment that I've seen to date. I mean, I talk to, again, I'm a global guy. I talk to companies around the world in the private sector, and they're all, 99% are investing in generative AI. But if you talk to the CFO and say, show me the return on investment to date, they normally can't give you something that's positive. Everybody's driven by the fear of being left out. Somebody else is going to solve it, and I'm going to be that crucial step behind them. So we're all sort of on faith experimenting, but where we started earlier, we haven't yet found that killer application of Gen AI that says, I absolutely positively have to have this. It's transformational.
I have a friend named Mike Traskos. He's brilliant, got a master's degree in physics, and he owns his own company. He does wire testing for aerospace. And he told me that standards are like toothbrushes. Everyone wants to use their own.
Yeah.
And now we got to get to standards. I would guess, from an outsider, there must be commonly accepted models of security. And what role does the government, my listeners, play in putting together this evolution of this relatively new threat?
John, you hit on something that to me is one of the big blinking light, red light problems with generative AI right now. And that is, we talk about securing it, and people talk about securing their query data, because the reality is, from an organization, 1 in 10 queries typically contain sensitive data that gets into the training record, and you worry about somebody recovering it. Or how do you secure the model weights, that actually have trained and refined the model? Those are symptoms of a bigger problem, John, and that is that we don't yet have a commonly accepted model of security responsibilities. Now, the good news is most of those protections are really available, but the bad news is it's a la carte in the sense that you can't even really say the menu is organized by here's appetizers, here's main courses, and here's desserts. It's like it's all here, and you have to go in and specify it. We have that for cloud security. There is now a shared security responsibility model for cloud. We didn't have that in the early days. People migrated to the cloud, those early adopters, and then when a problem happened, they said, "What? I put my stuff in the cloud. What do you mean you're not responsible for it?" And now it's pretty well understood what the data center is going to do, what you're going to do, and then that gray area between that you can contract back for. We don't have that for generative AI, and that means you've got to really go in and set it. Now, I've always talked about government levers for driving change, and in this case, the power of procurement is one. If government says, here are the things we expect that we want to do, how we want the training data secured, and then even more fundamentally, how the training data, the models, and even the architecture get secured. We have seen compromises, one earlier this year, where failing to actually lock down how data got coordinated, how models ran between data centers, servers in different places, failing to lock that down was always somebody else's responsibility. So nobody did it. And we found out we got exploited by a bad guy for real since last year. the government starting to specify answers to those kind of questions in its contracts for Gen AI services, I think can dramatically accelerate what took us years to do in cloud security. Government and the power of procurement is I think, a strong lever here.
I wrote down killer app when I'm listening to you, and I opened up this podcast with some silly reference to a documentary on HBO last night called Wild Wild Space. In the documentary, they say in the next 5 years, there's going to be 100,000 satellites all around the Earth and tons of debris. Space junk is a problem. Well, there's my killer app, Jim. I submit that to you. Little Jim starts Jim software, and he figures out where all these pieces of space are going to be. Talk about a complex problem. That's what you have to have some advanced knowledge. I mean, there's a tough one for you, Jim. Is that the killer app? Come on, man. Tell me.
Well, that one really is. And it's the government, federal government has been tracking that kind of stuff for a long time. And they've agreed, Space Command has said, we need to privatize some of this because there's so much of that now. And again, with, to your point, it's 100,000 or actually more private sector vehicles up there. They got skin in the game of avoiding running into stuff too. So let's let them do some of the monitoring and solve part of the problem. It's a big problem.
When I talk to military guys who had boots in the ground, they talk about situational awareness. When I talk to people at the Space Force, they talk about situational awareness, which means the satellite's coming at them with no fuel and they can't correct course. And it's I don't know how people can even figure out these mathematical problems, Jim. It's just maybe that's a way to take and leverage artificial intelligence. The problems that are just too tough, you have some human guidance, and then you make the transition to have them do the hard stuff, huh?
But yeah, John, and you raised something when you talked about the military that I think is really relevant to our conversation around Gen AI. And again, as somebody who, I had 34 years in government and now I've been in the private sector. And I go, there was a time, the space race and much of the Cold War, when the federal government drove tech innovation, created semiconductors, the internet came out of ARPANET, government really drove technology innovation. And then, you pick your time, 30 years plus ago, the torch passed to the private sector. And now the federal government, other than niche areas, is a fast follower rather than driving innovation. There's more money, there's more talent in the private sector. Gen AI is a different thing. I do a lot of reading of the unclassified literature about what the federal government is doing. And when we look at generative AI and automation, doing something faster and/or at scale, and autonomy, I look at what the government is doing. It's like, we're talking about self-driving cars where we're challenged to make them work, where we have well-marked roads, we have literal rules of the road, not that everybody always follows them, but you can program that kind of stuff in. And then the military has got ships that have literally gone from one continent to another and back without a human on board. We're talking about, co-pilots to help us in our online navigation at home. There are co-pilots, there are actual unmanned vehicles, both on land and in the air. The military, national security community, I think, is likely to drive AI, Gen AI in particular, in a way that the requirements and the use cases that they've articulated, I think, are more advanced than many of the ones I've seen in the private sector. The torch for this little area may have passed back to government, and what they pioneer in terms of things like autonomy and automation will then trickle to the private sector.
About a month ago, I did an interview with this French guy from Airbus, and I said, well, in all of France, is there a crystal ball? Can you look into the future? And I guess he was insulted by that. Well, Jim, you live in Leesburg. You got a crystal ball there in Leesburg, and you're down and gaze into the future? So gaze into that crystal ball there in Leesburg, Virginia. You've been around, man. You've seen stuff. So what's going to be this longer impact of generative AI? Too soon to tell?
Well, John, what I want to do is I want to throw out an assumption that I think is becoming problematic. And, because I go to a lot of conferences and people say innovation in generative AI is going to come from the private sector. Well, I said, use cases may be or maybe not. But there's this idea that the private sector will build the capability, build these new data centers and plug them in, and they'll have power. Now, the scary part is, John, to unleash what may or may not be unprecedented power from generative AI, it's going to require unprecedented amounts of power in the form of electricity. A server that's doing training for Gen AI uses as much as 7 times as much juice as a server that's doing e-commerce or, SaaS applications. The reality is addressing how to power Gen AI at scale is going to be a public-private sector problem. There's a role for the federal government. I mean, the aspects range from innovation on how you're going to generate the power. And people are saying, when you talk to the hyperscalers, the huge companies that want to start replacing individual data centers. I live in a place with 300 of them. They're now saying we want to move from these city block-sized buildings to having small city-sized campuses. And having our own, and then to put our own power center in the middle of that campus. And ideally, we would like it to be a nuclear plant. This is a new conversation, John, about how to power this. We're trying to build an infrastructure that, power is a regulated sector. So there's a role for government. You got to figure out how to deal with, I need more Gen AI, trying to build an electric vehicle infrastructure. I'm trying to onshore advanced manufacturing. I got to figure out where I generate the power is not always where I want to use it. There's climate implications in terms of carbon and clean water consumption. This is the thing. We're busy thinking of that killer app and how to transform this. And I go, this is not like Field of Dreams. If you build it and you plug it in, you may shut the grid down unless we figure out how to deal with this. And a lot of the three-letter agencies, the EPAs, the Departments of Energy, DOD, CISA, smaller bodies at the federal level have got to be key players in solving this problem. That's the thing about generative AI that I think is the elephant in the room is power.
Right. And I think we're at the perfect intersection geographically and theoretically of commercial applications and data centers in the federal government. So yeah. We'll see. So we'll get you on in 6 months and say, well, did they build that nuclear power facility in Ashburn, Virginia, Jim?
Well, and
can you imagine that?
Well, that's the problem, John. It's a 5-plan. No, nuclear takes 25 years, but just permitting and building anything else is 5 years. So now I do a lot of work at the state level, and I've testified before some states about generative AI, and they say, forget how you're going to use it. You guys at the state level, because, state utility commissions, you need to figure out, can you make your state be a permissive place to even run this stuff? 5 years from now, you need to address it now to have that answer for 2030.
Wow. What a great conversation. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Jim Richberg, head of cyber policy and global field CISO for Fortinet, also board member for Fortinet Federal. Thanks, Jim.
John, I always enjoy talking to you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.